Hi, this is Paul, and we're going to have a conversation today about the Christian Reformed Church. And with us is Clay Libolt. He's been on the channel before. We should credit John Van Donk for setting this thing up. John Van Donk, the troubler of Israel, just can't. Now, I tried to get John to come on, and he did not want to. And also Ken Hendricks, who has really made, I think, a big splash on the scene with his Substack. Clay, why don't you give a brief introduction? You've been on the channel before, and then we'll have Kent introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm a retired pastor. Been retired for a kind of a long time now. I was the pastor of a CRC church, a Christian Reformed church in East Lansing, Michigan, for a long time, 31 years. Since that time, I've done a lot of interims, but all on the West Coast. So I've done interims in Southern California. I have done in Oregon, several in Washington State. I actually was an interim principal of a high school for a year, a job for which I was singularly unqualified, and now I am in just finishing up an interim in Walnut Creek, California,
Okay.
and that's where
All
I'm
right.
at.
Okay. And Kent, who are you?
Who am I? It's a good question. So I'm from Linden, Washington, one of the small Dutch enclaves that many of us know about, as is Clay. Um, Born there, raised there, Christian school there. I was baptized at Third CRC in Linden a long time ago, and that was really where I grew up and spent my entire childhood. My parents are from there, my grandparents are from there, my great grandparents are from there, and my great great grandparents moved there. They all kind of migrated there about 110 years ago or so, 120 years ago. So on both my parents' sides, both my dad and my mom, a lot of history in that town, and of course lots of friends and relatives still there. I left for Calvin when I was 18, came to Grand Rapids primarily to get out of Linden. That was kind of my goal. And actually, Clay, I don't know if you know this, but I wasn't planning to go to Calvin until a conversation we had my sophomore year at the Dutch Mother's restaurant. I don't know if you remember this or not. But that was a little bit instrumental in getting me out of Linden after I graduated. Linden Christian High School, where I went at the time, was about 100 students in each grade, give or take a little. I think it might be a little bit smaller now. I'm not sure exactly. And three of us went to Calvin, three out of 100.
Really?
Yeah, which is not a lot. That was fewer than previous years, and I think it's even declined a little bit. So I went to Calvin, and I was looking for kind of a broadly, liberal arts education. I thought I would be a teacher. My first few months at Calvin, that was kind of the track I was thinking I would go in, be an education major. I took one class and quickly changed my major. Just wasn't for me. But that was, those were formative years for me. I ended up, I was a religion and theology major at the time and an English minor, but I just took a lot of kind of classes that interested me. Everything from meteorology to a bunch of literature classes. And actually, my English minor was accidental. I mean, at the end, it wasn't, but I just took several classes from the faculty there and loved them. And so it kind of accumulated, basically an English minor there as well. But just loved the broad, liberal arts education that Calvin had to offer. It really was a formative 4 years for me in significant ways. But in that time, I felt what I thought was a call to ministry. So I kind of took the pre-sem track as well. So I was taking Greek and, took Greek with Ken Bratt and others there. Really loved it. That was Attic Greek, because that was part of what was at the time, I think, a classics major, which is now not there anymore, I believe. Really enjoyed that. And then went to Calvin Seminary after my 4 years at Calvin, headed MDiv, CRC ordination, the whole deal. The further I got into my MDiv, the more I realized I did not want to be a pastor. I found myself gravitating toward the library and toward books and ideas, and I felt like people kind of got in the way of that sometimes. And
That could be a theme of this entire conversation.
and I knew that I didn't like the pastoral care classes. I didn't love the preaching. I just and those that felt like a bit of a red flag for me. So the further, the further I was there, the longer I was there, the more I avoided those kinds of classes and the less I tried in those classes, I guess, to really put it bluntly. My desk in the library at Calvin, I know it's changed probably since the two of you have been there, but it was on the fourth floor, kind of above Heminga Hall. And all the stacks right there are just, the history. I mean, the fourth floor is kind of where it's at. And I would just quickly wrap up whatever I had to do for a class and then just sort of spend an hour or two kind of doing my own thing in there a little bit. So 2 years of that, a little over 2 years of that, and I sensed that ordination was not a path I should be on. This was 2007, right when the economy was crashing. It was not a good place to be if you're in Grand Rapids with a broad liberal arts degree and part of a master's degree and an MDiv. So my wife and I, we had recently gotten married, and she ended up taking a job in Linden, Washington, which is the town that I came from. And so I decided, well, I'm kind of in this not sure what I'm going to do phase. So I arranged to start taking classes at Fuller Seminary, which at the time had an extension campus in Seattle, and have them transferred back to Calvin Seminary. So even if I wasn't going to become ordained or go that route, I could still finish the degree potentially. So I did that for most of the next year while she taught at Linden Christian High School, which is where I graduated from just 6 years before. So she was teaching with all the teachers that I had. So I spent a semester at Fuller in Seattle, driving down from Linden, once or twice a week, taking classes there. And midway through, I kind of felt like this just wasn't going to be where I wanted to end. And over Christmas break, that winter, I guess it would have been like the Christmas of 2007, kind of walked away from the degree. So I still have about 80% or so of an MDiv. Maybe I'll go back and finish it at some point. But I think actually the MDiv at Calvin has shrunk to the extent now that I might actually have finished on paper, but I don't really know. So these were back in the 4-year MDiv days.
I don't know if you know this, but in the days when you were deciding all of that, a faculty member, I think your faculty advisor, I'll leave nameless, but at Calvin Seminary, contacted me, and we met in a dive bar in Grand Rapids to talk about you.
Oh man, I did not know this.
This is going to give insight into people of the Christian. Most of my viewers are not Christian Reformed, and Clay is actually Kent's uncle. So this will give people a sense of how familial the Christian Reformed Church is, and even just that little story is not untypical of a way that the Christian Reformed Church has been. So keep going, Kent. So you're in Linden, Washington, and you're dropping out of an MDiv, and your wife is teaching in Christian school. This is a very Christian Reformed story.
Yeah. Well, and just to go back to Clay's comment, I'm certain that person was John Bolt, whose classes I loved, but I think he sensed in me before I did that I was not called to be a minister in the Christian Reformed Church as well. I loved his classes though. So yeah, we were in Linden. This is late 2007, and there I am, kind of unemployed without much to do, and trying to think through what I was going to do next. And after that, just a couple months kind of looking around and thinking through things, ended up getting a job in marketing at Logos Bible Software. Back in those days, the software was called Libronics. It was used at Calvin Seminary. I think it probably still is by some people. And I spent a long time working there until about 2015. We lived in Linden. We were back at 3rd CRC for most of that. Coming to Grand Rapids to visit my in-laws, once or twice a year. Just making our life there. And then in 2015, and I'm skipping a lot here, but in 2015, we moved back to Grand Rapids. I took a job at Zondervan, where I work now. So I've always, since then, basically been in Christian publishing, specifically academic publishing, academic imprints. So my life now is all related to Zondervan Academic and the books we publish and the authors we work with. But we're in Grand Rapids, and kind of adjacent to all these things.
Where do you go to church?
We're at Madison Square, CRC here in town.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I was at Madison when there was sort of a transformation in the 80s. I started going to Madison in probably about the year you were born, in 1983. I
Yep.
started going to Madison, and or 84, and then I stayed with them. And then actually when I was a seminarian, they needed an elder, and Dave Beelan thought me being an elder for a year would probably be good preparation for seminary. So I became an elder at Madison Square, very young elder. It was a great year. Really, learned a lot, because it's one thing, always being around church. It's another thing to actually be an elder in a church and do house visit and all of that. So.
And those were some years of pretty significant growth and change too. The 80s and 90s at Madison, it kind of transitioned from a pretty small kind of street front church to what it is now then, right?
When I started going to the church, they probably had about 250 in worship on a Sunday. And then by the time I left there were over 1,000 a Sunday. And that's when they were starting to they hadn't built the new sanctuary yet. But Dave and Dante were both there. And my father had known Dante from his New York City days, because Patterson had, during when heroin was sort of going through the East Coast, there was in New York City, there was an addicts rehabilitation center that was started through the old Manhattan CRC. And then in North Jersey, then we had the North Side Addicts Rehabilitation Center, which eventually moved next door to the church. And so I grew up going to church with a bunch of recovering heroin addicts who, when I was a kid, I didn't appreciate what a recovering heroin addict was. These were just more people in my life. And no, it's well, let's start now. Part of what both of these guys do in the Christian Reformed Church is they're both bloggers, and they're probably at this point two of the most prominent bloggers. Clay has a blog, Peripatetic Pastor, that he has been working for a number of years. How long has your blog been going, Clay?
Actually, it's been going for even longer, but I sort of abandoned it for a while, and then came back to it in the lead up to the 2022 Synod. So I started when my first posts on that blog were when the Human Sexuality report hit the public, and I responded to that, sort of asking two questions. One, did they do, given the assumptions of the HSR, did they do a good job? And then the second question was, what about those assumptions? Are they valid? So that's where it started, and I've kept it up pretty much since then.
And Kent, when did you start your Substack?
on
why?
Yeah, well, the when is easy. That was about a month ago, 6 weeks ago or so.
Oh, okay.
And the why, I mean, I've always kind of followed the polity and the politics and the institutions of the CRC. I mean, it's been my home, and I'm not an office bearer. I'm not involved in any kind of official way. I'm not an elder or deacon, and of course, not ordained. But I'm always interested in it, and I think I'm kind of just interested in general how institutions work and think and how they get things done. And I'm also interested in the in human behavior, I guess, broadly speaking. I mean, my day job is marketing. That's what I do, which really is kind of thinking through how people make decisions and how aware they are of those decisions. And in some sense, marketing is selling a thing, but in more ways, it's creating a market. I mean, it's creating an environment for an idea to make sense. So that's just kind of a broad area of interest for me. Anyway, yeah, I followed Synod and, the Acts of Synod, read the agenda when it came out and kind of just track along with it like a lot of other people. And I had posted a couple things on Facebook. One thing that I posted, and I might have my order wrong, but I think I was kind of wondering, I read some criticism or saw something about the number of women delegates to Synod. And I don't remember the context of it, but I kind of wonder, like, I wonder, like, how many delegates are there, and is it going up or down? And surely somebody in the denominational office knows that or is tracking that. I would assume. I don't know. I couldn't easily find that information, so I thought, well, this is not hard to figure out. So I mean, these are public data points, right? And so I spent like an hour. I don't, it's kind of ridiculous to say this, but I just went through all the agendas since was it 2008 or 9? I can't remember the year. And just counted. And there's some names I didn't know if they, some names could be for either men or women. And then there were several Korean delegates where I couldn't easily figure out the whether it was a man or woman. And so I mean,
for
it was
the
kind
Korean
of
delegates, I could probably help you there.
Yeah,
well,
right.
yeah, right. I mean, I made some assumptions, right? So it's not perfect, but there was just this question I had, and I posted it, so I figured it out and made a little Excel graph, and I posted it on Facebook, and it's got some attention and some interest. And there was maybe one or two other things like that over the last couple months or since the agenda came out, where I just kind of had a question where people are talking about it, arguing about it. It's kind of ideologically driven. And I didn't find a lot of people looking to some of these just data points right in front of you, that are apparent if you take a little time to look for them. And I think I was getting ready to post my second or third thing on Facebook, and I was just thinking, like, nobody cares about this. This is just not the way to to operate on Facebook. My friends, family, this is just too obscure. And so I posted what I was going to post on Facebook on a Substack instead. I just decided, well, I'll just put this here, and whoever can follow it can follow it. And specifically what it was some stuff in I think it was the 1994 agenda, or maybe it was 95, but it was essentially an argument, it was against the 94 decision that kind of prohibited women serving in office. And the substance of a lot of the overtures, and I know you the two of you lived through this is before me, but the substance of those overtures had to do with, well, it's not confessional status. I mean, there were several overtures that used that language. And I was reading this thinking, like, my word, there's a lot of parallels here with 21 and 22 and the conversation there. And I wondered, did someone or a group of people going into Synod 2021, which obviously didn't happen, as they were kind of marshaling a response, were they thinking, well, look what happened in 94, and look how the moderates and the left, and I know those are sloppy terms, but look how the moderates and the left kind of shut down what we wanted to do in 94 in 95 with that argument. So if we're going to, again, I have no idea if this actually happened, right? But if we're going to go into Synod 2022 and talk about the human sexuality report, and I guess really this started back in 2016 is when the conversation about the confessions came up with regard to this issue. But I kind of imagine, is there this cabal of people on the right who are like, we need to frame this argument in this way because we didn't do it in 94 and look what happened. I am not saying that happened. I kind of doubt it really did, but there's some very odd parallels there that that I thought, Aaron, I'm just going to write this down and post it. And I was like, I don't want to post it on Facebook because that just felt a little bit weird. So that's where the Substack started. There's more to it, but that's kind of how it started. So, but again, that wasn't my history that I lived through. I know the two of you were very active in those conversations back in the 90s and 80s and 70s too.
So Kent, the question about confessionality for decisions about human sexuality came forth for the first time in 2016. In the aftermath of that, there was a committee, a study committee that presented a report that presented essentially a kind of moderating position. They did not change the moral status about that had been established in the CRC for more than 20 years, 30 years, but they tried to find ways to allow, say, a pastor who has a gay daughter to attend the wedding. That's essentially what that thing was about. And there was a very organized response to that. The first time I saw that, actually, in watching
in 2016 at Synod, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that they asked, and that they put in the mandate to the then Human Sexuality Committee that reported in 2022 is, do these things have confessional status? So that's where it arose for the first time.
But I think I think Kent is right in that we should probably wind the clock back to the women in office fights, because I was in seminary in the 80s at the time. I remember actually one of my now just recently retired colleagues in the seminary mailroom stuffing our mailboxes with Christian renewal. And then we had a big fight over access to mailboxes at the seminary. And so, there have been fights all along. My recollection, now I was younger, so Clay was more active and he might remember better than I do. But in the women in church office fight, James DeYoung, who was the president of Calvin Seminary when I was at Calvin Seminary, see, part of how this story evolves is also the evolution of institutions. And so, Kent, I think you're right on in terms of thinking institutionally and tracking institutionally. I remember James DeYoung sort of announced, Calvin Seminary president, at that point in CRC culture, Calvin Seminary president had a degree of authority. Now, James DeYoung, and Clay, you can probably fill this in, James DeYoung is part of a conservative family in the Christian Reformed Church that, so James was sort of a moderate conservative. And even the seminary faculty, when I got there in 1986, there was an old guard who was sort of going out. John Steck, Andy Banstra, Carl Krominga. These guys had been put in a fight a generation before where there had been sort of a seminary purge, okay? And then David Howarda, this group of seminary professors was sort of considered kind of on the moderate to progressive side. There was a lot of questions about John Steck in terms of his thoughts. Clay will know this about Genesis and science issues. David Howarda temperamentally was sort of a moderate, kind of kept his mouth shut, didn't speak very loudly. So kind of what was happening around women in office, Neil Plantinga, who had, Alvin's younger brother, had a fair amount of status, was sort of pushing that. Laura Smith was a couple of years ahead of me in seminary. And so a lot of things were happening at that point, but there was kind of a declaration in sort of the moderate, even conservative moderate group where sort of James DeYoung was in, and he's still alive. So it'd be interesting to track down a bunch of this history before these people pass away. But there was sort of a consensus. What I heard at Calvin Seminary was, this is not a confessional issue. Women in office was not a confessional issue. Now, I'm sure that people further to the right at that point were very unhappy with that, because there was sort of a moderate consensus that we're going to have this debate, but in the end, this is not something we want to split the church over. Now, there was a split because of this when it actually happened eventually in the 90s. But in the 80s, there was sort of a consensus in the powers that be that this was not a confessional issue. But it was also interesting that when I was at seminary, the new crop of seminarians coming in, I was right there at sort of the hinge. Ari Later was considered a conservative. A lot of the new, John Bolt was just coming into the seminary. He was considered a conservative. And so at that point, the seminary was sort of transitioning from a bunch of people that the conservatives saw as a little bit suspect, like John Steck. And then, more seminarians were coming in. And that was during the 80s as well. So I was at Calvin during sort of the Reagan Revolution. And so politically in the country, there's kind of a swing back to conservatism. And that was sort of reflected in the CRC at that point. And I don't know, Clay, if you can flesh that out any better, because again, you were a bit older.
I can flesh it out a lot, but I'm not sure how much of it the viewers are actually going to be interested in. But
I'm not worried about them. I do what's interesting to me on this channel.
So Paul, this whole story is part of the story of a CRC in which these discussions were very much being had by the denomination as a whole, in a certain sense. There was a sense of participation in the denomination that no longer exists. But so to take through that little bit of that history, James DeYoung was a son of P.Y. DeYoung, who actually was a professor at seminary when I was there, who was a son of Y.P. DeYoung, who was the pastor of the largest CRC at the time, which was in Granville, Michigan, and was a megachurch. And he was a solo pastor there with enormous amounts of influence in an immigrant community. He mixed drugs up. He would go to a pharmacy and mix up drugs to help out his people. Just a towering figure. And James DeYoung was, I think you're right, kind of a moderate conservative. He was definitely seen by people in the church as being a conservative. A kind of a move towards coming off of John Crominga, who Crominga family was also very prominent in the CRC. His father had been a professor and a pastor. His brother Carl, you mentioned, taught at the seminary and so forth. So with James, the one thing I have to fill in is that in 1981, Synod decided that I shouldn't be a CRC pastor because of my views on Genesis. And when I went back in 86, I think it was 86, one of the people who helped me out was James DeYoung. And there was a pivotal hearing with a subcommittee of the Board of Trustees, and he attended that, which gave it a status that perhaps it wouldn't have had if he hadn't been there. So I owe a debt to James DeYoung. I remember going out and talking to him. I think a lot of that was brokered by Al Hoxbergen, who was my boss in River Terrace at the time. You mentioned John Steck prominently. John Steck also had a huge influence in my life. He was a professor of Old Testament. One of the first things he did, we had a course on Joshua, or it was on former prophets, and he said to me, said to us, write a paper on the literary structure of Joshua. I had never thought to myself that the Bible could have a literary structure, and I did. And he liked my paper a lot and asked to keep it in his files. And it was out of that I became, that I eventually ended up going to graduate school in Old Testament, essentially. John was very much a conservative, but he was also attuned to the text. He was a person who the text mattered to a good deal. In fact, I'm a little sorry about this, but towards the end of his life, he and I had a big argument about the translation of a word in Romans 3. He was very angry at me because I had presented something at Synod which involved that. But it was a typical kind of John Steck thing. It was. Anyway, John was a wonderful man, and all of those people. Andy Banstra would probably have leaned a little the other direction. You mentioned David Hallward. David Hallward studied under Bultmann in Europe. He was a conservative sort of guy, could be dry as dust, but had he was. In some ways, one of the most insightful theologians that I studied under. And I have some very fond memories of David Hallward.
Yeah,
I
loved that group at seminary. There used to be said of David Hoda, he would say more things with one lip than most people said with two.
Yeah.
And but there was at that point, so this was sort of in the heat of the women in a church office fight. And but there was, I think, a difference in the denomination at that point where there still was in the 80s a sense of this is the CRC was sort of still a Cosa Nostra. This was our thing. And of course, because of what was happening, let's say in places like Northside where I grew up, with the racial reconciliation movement, push for diversity, trying to open things up. But what I really appreciate about you, Kent, is you are bringing to the discussion something that I think has long been too much ignored, where another guy that I should probably have back on the channel, who's been on the channel before very early on, is David Snapper, because I've always been surprised, as you were, Kent, that it seemed to me the denomination as an institution was paying very little attention to the kinds of demographics and details that you are tracking in your Substack. Because even in the 70s and 80s, your leadership was it was sort of our gang. And we talk about the Cromingas and the DeYoungs and very much certain groups at the Greenways. Paul DeVries, again, his father had been pastor of this church I'm sitting in. The Christian Reformed Church was this extended family network that had familial ties. You just put a really lovely piece on your Substack about the origins of Lyndon, Washington. And for people who are super interested in CRC history, there's a magazine called Origins that gets very little attention, but it's just a lovely publication that is just full and full and full of all of these family stories of immigrants coming in. And
Paul, you know where that you can find Origin magazine being read is go to Lyndon, Washington, and you will find, if everybody has a chair they sit in to read and a little thing alongside of it to put stuff in. Origin magazine will be in that.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is culturally a thing. And then, I think, what happens with the women in church office issue in the 80s is something of a manifestation of what happens with the boomer generation, who that comes back, people like, some of my father's favorite professors. There's George Staub and there's Henry Staub, and they were very different individuals. But my father loved Henry Staub, and he had taught at the college, and then he had taught at the seminary. He, of course, was someone who would regularly get into hot water for this or that. But a very important figure in the post-World War II Christian Reformed Church. Spoolhoff, who had sort of been a spy. These were the people that sort of shepherded the institutions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Spoolhoff, he still had an office at Calvin when I was there at the beginning of the 80s. And the Christian Reformed Church was sort of a familial thing. There had been wars in the pre-war issues. The Protestant Reformed split, and there had been a purge at the seminary, over modernism and some of these things. But after the Second World War, you still had a fairly conservative church, but the leadership that would be in those post-war years had been shaped by the war. And then you sort of had the heyday of the Calvin philosophy department. You had this sense that the Christian Reformed Church was sort of coming into its own. You had this, big transformations at Calvin College in terms of an organization that wanted to sort of have an impact. At this time, also in the larger Christian world, you had the rise of the neo-evangelicals. I actually met Carl F. Henry a Sunday morning in the Commons at Calvin College. He was doing a thing at Calvin, and I saw this old man sitting having breakfast by himself. I kind of felt sorry for him, so I went and I sat next to him, and introduced myself, and he introduced himself. And I said I was going to Calvin Seminary. He said, "Oh, that's probably a good idea, because Calvin Seminary is one of these last few seminaries that's going to require you to learn Greek and Hebrew." And so there's all of this change going on. And in many ways, I see the women in church office fight as kind of the culmination of a lot of the civil rights liberationist movements that get started in the 60s and 70s in the CRC. My father, of course, very integral in racial reconciliation issues in the Christian Reformed Church. Earl Marlink, who started this church, left from Chicago in disgust after the Timothy Christian fight and came out here because this little church had started, and he wanted to see if African Americans and Dutch CRC types could actually do church together. And so I think in many ways, the women in church office fight was seen as part and parcel of this civil rights movement, because of course there was African American issues, and then anti-Jim Crow, and then the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s. And I see that as a culmination of this. And I think this was, for many people in the Christian Reformed Church, kind of the rise of it. But and we can get into the question of the circulatory thesis that I have, in the women in church office fight, and now Clay is in Walnut Creek. If you would go back and look at the yearbooks and look at churches like Walnut Creek, Palo Alto, San Jose, Hayward, you would see churches in look at New Jersey, where I grew up. You look at Chicago, you look at Los Angeles, you would find a group of Christian Reformed churches, in many ways might have seeded early, like Alameda was fairly early in California, but Alameda was a very different place when Alameda CRC started. Yeah. But you find a whole group of churches that had been the product of the baby boom years, the post-war years, who went into major American metropolitan areas. Toronto, I'm not going to talk about Toronto because Canadians get touchy. You can write that yourselves. In these world-class cities, Christian Reformed people were moving into these cities. They're getting jobs in major corporations. They were establishing Christian Reformed churches. And so when I was growing up, people would come from these places. Linden, Seattle, you guys can discern the relationship between Linden and Seattle. But there were churches from New Jersey, my parents' church, churches from the Bay Area, Palo Alto CRC, sort of known as the Calvin Alumni Association West. That was so much a part of the Palo Alto CRC identity. The Sacramento church, in many ways, was Dutch Christian Reformed because of people who would migrate up from Ripon, but also during the years from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had regular influx of Calvin College grads who would move to Sacramento for work and come in here and quickly become leaders. And that shaped these churches in major metropolitan areas. And many of these churches were the churches that pushed votes over the edge for things like women in office.
Yeah.
And today, it's a completely different landscape.
Well, and I think there was a parallel transition happening at the edges of this circulatory system. I mean, I remember in Linden in the 90s, I was young, but I remember the conversations at Third CRC about women in office, which I'm not going to try to, represent because I was young, but I do remember, Henry Newman was the pastor there, and he voted to allow it at Synod. I don't know if that's where the rest of the church was. It certainly was not where much of Linden was, but the argument, the debates over it, the conversations all still felt like they were happening within the family, even into the late 90s. Even though at the time, those are fourth and fifth generation for the descendants of immigrants. And so, we were still kind of talking family business when we argued over that kind of stuff.
Right.
And there's a dynamic of that's kind of gone a little bit now in the current conversations. And Clay, I know, you're a generation before me. I know that it was even more pronounced in the 60s in Linden, where we can disagree and we can fight and argue, but it's still kind of, there's this sort of loyalty to, he's one. I mean, I think you've written this too, like he's one of us, and that's kind of going away in the denomination, especially at the edges of the system.
Yeah. So the story that I always told was that in the time when I was being questioned about my views on Genesis, there was a golf foursome in Linden, Washington, that included somebody who had learned about me and was a big critic, and used me to criticize not just me but the seminary and so forth, and was kind of going on and on about this. And finally, some of the other guys who had happened to be from Linden in this golf foursome took this guy aside and said, no, you don't do that. We know Clay. He grew up here. We like him. We don't agree with him, but we like him. And so, they stood behind me, which was just for me, a really kind of wonderful thing. That's the church that I mourn. Yeah, Paul, the story that you're telling is essentially right. Goes a little earlier in terms of the civil rights movement, and you mentioned a couple of points in that story, and the Vietnam War, of course.
Yeah.
And I was involved in all of those things because I'm old enough to have been involved in those. But just to give you an illustration on a kind of atmospheric illustration on the civil rights movement, when Timothy School, which decided, it was in Cicero, decided not to allow African American kids to go to that school, it came before a classis meeting of, I think, Chicago North, I think it was called at the time, and a person who was a pastor who had been hugely influential in my youth, the person that my mother would come home from his sermons and say, you could hear a pin drop. And so I had great admiration for this guy, stood up and defended the Cicero school board, and I walked away from that meeting feeling like something had shifted, something had changed. And so let's go back though to that sense of, I mean, the term you use is circulatory system. I'm not quite sure that works, but let's go back to that for a moment, because I think there's something there about denominational leadership. I mean, what happened to the CRC? And what happened to the CRC is that there were certain predictable things that were going to happen, but I didn't predict them. I mean, I did in some ways. I kept making this argument, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But everybody should have known that after a while, those kind of family ethnic ties that made sure that, so if a person who went to Calvin or had some CRC roots came to Walnut Creek, California for a job, that person was going to first look up, unless this church just didn't suit him at all, was going to come here, and within 2 years would be on consul and would be a leader in that church.
Yep.
But it was predictable that was going to go away eventually, because those kinds of bonds were loosening up. People were going to other schools. They were moving into, they didn't all move in the same neighborhood anymore. And so and then along with that, there was this evangelical wave, and the evangelical wave was destructive of all of that in many ways. And so these CRCs no longer had the feeder system. That happened I don't know how many years ago now. I was in River Terrace for 30. Well, you know what? We were starting to talk about it already when I first came there. So that was 80s, the very early 80s. I came to River Terrace, and already the church, before I even got there, was talking about the fact that that feeder system, which had sustained that church for a long time, people would move from Calvin. They would take jobs at Michigan State University. They'd be professors, or they would take jobs in state government because Michigan State government is in Lansing, Michigan, and they would settle there, and then they would join the church and become part of it. And then as soon as they retired, they'd move back to West Michigan. That was the circulatory system. That was it.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Right.
Yep.
And West Michigan wasn't Grand Rapids, it was Holland mostly, or Grand Haven, or whatever. You went to the beach after that, right? I mean, that was, if you made enough money, you bought beach property, and that's where you lived. So for my entire pastorate there, the big problem and the issue was, how do we become a church for East Lansing? A church in which East Lansing is first. I remember I had a staff person who said to me one day, Clay, in your sermons, you mention Calvin more often than you do Michigan State. And I realized instantly that that was a huge mistake, because Michigan State, my office looked at Michigan State, and we probably had 40 professors in the congregation. Michigan State was the life of this community, but we were talking about Calvin. There was, people would say to me, and they say to me now, actually at Walnut Creek, they would say to me, you know, we come and we like what we find here. You know, we like the worship, we like the people. It's a friendly place. And then at a certain point we hit a wall. And what was that wall? That wall was a wall of experiences and background. Ethnic is a kind of word you could throw over top of it, but it wasn't entirely ethnic. It had to do with Calvin. People went to Calvin, and if you didn't go to Calvin, you didn't have that experience in your repertoire, and so forth. So the CRC, this is a speech actually that I made a lot of times when I was a pastor to denominational people. The CRC did not help us to figure out how to break down that wall, and to present a church which was open to the East Lansing. We actually made some pretty good progress in East Lansing. That church became, in fact, at one time, a woman said to me in a new members class, so is this a denominational church? And I thought that was kind of a triumph, because you identify first with the congregation. You know, I long ago introduced this distinction between denominationalism with a big D and denominationalism with a little d. Denominationalism with a little d is all the things that denominations do for congregations and that you need. Denominational with the big D is denomination as identity. So where does you get your identity? You get it from the congregation, or you get it from the denomination? That was a huge question all the way through that whole thing. And that has not yet been entirely solved in the Christian Reformed Church. It is an ethnic church in many places still, and it does not know how to bring people in. And you know, we can talk more about that, but that's still true. And people hang on to it. So why do people go to, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Paul, was how do we make Walnut Creek succeed? So this is the congregation, as you said, I mean, you could tell that it could do the whole history just in terms of Walnut Creek. So Walnut Creek was a burgeoning church in the days when there were a lot of people moving in who had Calvin background. It got involved in a financial scandal that bled away some people. Then when women in office came, they called the pastor, and the pastor was in favor of women in office. And I just heard this story again yesterday, that the vote was very close to whether or not to call this person. And when the vote went in favor of calling this person, half the congregation left.
Yep.
Formed a URC.
Yep.
And then over the years since, it's kind of just gone down, till it's a very small congregation in a very large, beautiful facility, in a prime location. In a community that's very desirable to live in. It can't afford to live here, but it's very desirable to live in.
That's not a small point.
I know. I understand. You can't buy. I mean, young people can't buy houses in Walnut Creek. They can buy them in Concord, maybe.
They can't come back to it, right? The circulatory system can't bring them back.
No.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we just called the pastor here, and they could never afford to live in Walnut Creek if there wasn't a parsonage. There's a parsonage.
Well, so Clay, I have two follow-up questions real quick. One, do you think that, and these are honest questions, do you think that, I guess, how much of these challenges do you think are the contributing factors people leaving for places like the URC, like you mentioned, and how much of this is just sort of the institutional atrophy of, being 4, 5, 6 generations removed from kind of where this all started? Some of both. I mean,
so the issue was, and still is, how to present and this is to some extent the issue that we're fighting right now. What will be the identity of the post-ethnic CRC?
Right.
And right now, the identity of that church, I mean, the people that have the political power in the denomination are saying it will be a kind of Calvinism, which is pretty different from the Calvinism that I grew up with. It's not Kuyperian, it's more young, restless, and reformed kind of Calvinism. That will be the official stance, and so this will be a church that is against same-sex marriage, that comes down heavily in favor of penal substitutionary atonement. There's a kind of portrait of the theology and of God, actually, in that, which I find off-putting, but that's where the denomination is moving. There was a time back in 80s, 90s, teens maybe, that the denomination could have defined itself differently theologically. That kind of theological work never happened. The CRC does not do theology. They did at one time, maybe. You go to classes, Central California, and you listen to examinations of candidates, and they examine all kinds of people there. The right answers are the answers given by Louis Berkhoff in systematic theology, though. That's mid 20th century, and then it was kind of old in theology. And if you dare think differently than that, you're going to have some problems in your examination.
So instead of doing theology, we're kind of stuck. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, and so part of that story is, and let me just propose something here, which is that I want to use the Mueller categories. So I grew up in a church that was sincerity culture. That was when I was a kid, and so you were Christian Reformed because you were born Christian Reformed. And very few people actually became Christian Reformed in any other way. There weren't very many proselytes. But and it had roles. You went to church twice on Sunday. You sent your kids to Christian school. If you didn't send your kids to a Christian school, you're going to get a visit from the elders. You didn't go to movies. Your grandparents went to the movies when they were young, and they got a visit from the elders. And they long remembered that. My parents, I'll give you an even worse illustration. My parents were poor, and they were not able to entirely keep up their church payments. So what you did is you took the budget and you just divided it into however many families you had, and each family paid the same amount. That amount was assigned you. So they were not able to keep it up. They got a visit. Why aren't you keeping up your payments to the church? They didn't have the money to do it. Then in the time that I was in high school, and probably just a little bit before that, so this had been the 60s, early 60s, you started to get the encroachment of evangelical theology, and Billy Graham was the first inkling of that. Billy Graham would do his crusades, and he was doing one in Seattle, I remember. And the question is, do CRC churches send people? Do they volunteer? Do they support this? Or is that Arminian theology? And so it was partly an identity question. And what came up out of that was that your Christianity has to be not just going to church on Sunday, but it has to be authentic. So now we're moving from a sincerity culture into an authentic culture. And that happened not from the left, that happened from the right. You need to, in Linden, I remember people saying to me, and I didn't know how to react to this, Clay, you're not really a Christian. You go to church, but have you taken Jesus into your heart? That kind of thing. Adria remembers going to Vacation Bible School, and this is a great illustrative story. So she was going to Vacation Bible School.
That's your wife?
Yeah, my wife. Yes.
Okay.
My aunt.
Yeah, yeah, right. She was going to Vacation Bible School out in the country where they lived. You know where they lived, and there was a Baptist church, and they said to Adria, have you taken Jesus into your heart? So she went forward at the Vacation Bible School, and she came home and she told her mother, I took Jesus into my heart today, and her mother looked at her and kind of glared at her and said, you already did that, so something was shifting, right? It was going from the idea of a sincerity culture in which you play a role, and are you sincere in your role? Do you do your role well? That's really the question. And whether you do your role well or not is the judgment of the community, not your judgment entirely.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So are you a good father? Are you a good mother? Are you a good Christian? Are you a good church person? All of those kinds of things. That got in places like Linden, Washington, got blown up by the whole evangelical question. Do you really have? Are you going to be saved because you don't have Jesus in your heart? You just go to church. You're not really a Christian. And so there was a friend of mine who went off and had a experience in some kind of a evangelical setting, and he came back and told me I was not a Christian at all. So for me, the spiritual issue in my life for a long time was, do I have an authentic experience of God and Jesus?
Well, and even just to elaborate on that, even in the context of Linden, when Clay, you and I have talked a little bit about this, my dad co-owned a hardware store, and the obvious thing to do 50 or 100 years ago was you take over the hardware store, you take over the farm, you kind of have this role. I mean, just beyond the church as an institution, just in the way that everyone related to any kind of institution, it was so predefined. And there was no notion of trying to discover yourself through your role in an institution, because it was laid out for you plainly. And the CRC as an immigrant church slotted very well into that, at least in the community that I was from.
And your parents would be perfect illustrations of where this next step goes, which is that once you start to open up the question of, is your experience an authentic experience, all that sort of thing, suddenly it changes. It just shifted everything in ways that people did not entirely understand, but it made a huge difference. And so when CRC people got upset about things going on in the CRC, whether it was women in office or just something local happening, and there are, every church goes through seasons of difficulty. They leave and they don't go to the CRC. They go to a place where they have the kind of experience they're looking for, where they can at first sit in the back pews and just, or chairs, they're never pews. And so the largest church in Linden now, by far, is Christ the King.
North County Christ the King.
Right, North County Christ the King. Yeah, it's
Yep.
And it is it meets in a former grocery store, and it's filled with people that had been CRC, and all there are 5 congregations in Linden itself, and all of them are diminished to some extent. We could come back to that, but that's so. But now something new is happening, and I think that the Mueller thing gets at that pretty well, and that's this idea of what he calls. So he's had sincerity, authenticity. I mean, I went through the sincerity, authenticity kind of shift, and I had to figure out how to deal with that. Now it's the huge shift from authenticity culture to what they call prophilicity culture, in which, once again, the community matters, only now it's the virtual community. It's it's a very different kind of sense of community, but, and you no longer are worried about authentic experience. You're worried about the presentation of who you are. You're curating your image, your presentation on social media, but on a lot of other places. And you may have several different identities, and there's no great reason why you shouldn't. You can be one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and that's fine. That's just meeting the context. And the right wing in the CRC has seized that move, and the left wing can't figure it out at all.
Can you elaborate on that?
So
I'm about 60% sure of this distinction here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you think about well, I mean, I can give you a whole lot of examples of this in terms of, I probably could give you some left-wing examples too, but these are just ones that come to my mind. One of the people that was hugely influential in Linden, and probably in a lot of other places, was Rush Limbaugh. Because the dairy farmers all had radios in their milking parlors, and the radio was always for hours every morning would broadcast Rush Limbaugh, right?
I listened to Rush Limbaugh 3 hours every day when I picked raspberries.
Yeah,
in the 90s.
Right. So
that's what we did.
He was clever, funny, and almost everything that the right-wing political is now started with Rush, right, in many ways. Rush Limbaugh didn't start as a conservative. That became a kind of, he started, I think he actually had a phase when he was kind of a garden variety liberal, but that's not where the money was. I mean, that's probably attributing motives, but he moved into a profile which is become self-reinforcing, in which he was this kind of funny, sarcastic guy who owned the libs, and created all this stuff. That's what Mueller's talking about in this book. He's talking about the fact that you adopt an identity, and you may believe it deeply or you may not believe it deeply. It doesn't matter. Once you develop this kind of profile, it's self-reinforcing. You get clicks for that, and then that leads you to more clicks and so forth. That's kind of the thing that's going on. So there's a sense in which the people who came out of actually the Young, Restless, and Reformed people, Kevin DeYoung, he was my neighbor for a while, have that kind of profile. You look at them and there's that kind of profile idea, right? I mean, they've adopted a way to be public, a kind of profile. And when I look at the CRC right, I see some of that happening. But there's an interesting connection here. So if you think about it in terms of three things, the sincerity culture, this is way too simple, but the sincerity culture, the authenticity culture, and the prophilicity culture, the sincerity culture and the prophilicity culture have some things in common, like this idea of community, that it's community reinforcing. So that people who are still kind of in that sincerity culture hear in the people in the prophilicity culture the things that they want to hear, even though the prophilicity culture is just ideologically totally different. And the people that are getting sandwiched in between are the people in the authenticity culture. I mean, there's all these books now, have been for a while, the kind of channeling Charles Taylor that, and these books are
like that one right here.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So these books are all saying, oh, we moved from, they don't use the sincerity, authenticity, but we moved from this way of being, from identity being assigned to us to this new kind of fraught authenticity culture. And what a terrible thing that modernity has already moved beyond that. The people that are in the authenticity culture are kind of caught in a time warp. As usual, we're talking, criticizing people who, already themselves try to figure out how to navigate this next thing. So that's the way I read that. I think that the CRC right is a very different animal than was the old CRC sincerity culture that I grew up in.
The conservatives of the 80s and so on.
Right.
Or 70s and 60s.
The classic example of this would be the guy you mentioned. I won't mention his name, but who is the elder who comes from Iowa every year to Synod dressed in overalls.
Yep.
Oh, Herb's watching. Yeah, Herb writes me. So
okay. Right. So you suggest, I mean, you kind of in your Substack kind of suggested that, this guy is who elders are, but he isn't.
You don't think so?
No, this guy is profiling. This guy does not come accidentally to Synod in overalls. He comes to Synod to present a profile of a certain kind of, hayseed intellectual or whatever, hayseed, so that, he gets all kinds of respect there, and he comes to every Synod. So he's been to Synods for years. And he is concerned with the clicks. He's getting the clicks, actually.
You are right about that. Yeah, I mean, he is definitely, you're right. There's a purpose to it, but I do still think that, when I think of most elders, for example, and especially a lot of these rural communities, like the one I grew up in, and I keep using Linden as an example because that's the experience I have and you have as well. But I still have to think that, there are churches whose church calendars revolve around planting seasons. I know there are in Iowa, at least. and service times revolve around the milking of cows, and that is changing. That is definitely changing. And you're right, there are certain people in the denomination who are playing a role, so to speak. But I think the mistake that a lot of those in Grand Rapids have made is that they think that that is dropped to zero, and that that is just a relic of the past, when it's very much not past, I don't think.
No, it's not past at all, because it's new. That's what's
No, see, and well, let's talk about your thesis, Clay, because I agree with a lot of it, and I agree with a lot of it because a lot of this I have laid out in my videos. But a piece that for example, probably one of the most important books in the Christian Reformed Church in the
Yep.
last while has been this one, and Kristen is probably the highest profile in certain communities, the highest profile member of the Christian Reformed Church, the highest profile professor at Calvin University. This, by a long ways, I would imagine, is the best-selling book by a Calvin University professor, could be ever.
Ever. There's never been a Calvin University professor before Kristen on the New York Times bestseller list.
Right. So major monumental work. And my problem with this work is not that she can recognize Americanism and evangelicalism and their intertwined stories. That, you can, to see that, you can go all the way back to Amy Semper McPherson.
Yeah, okay.
A name that, well, not Christian Reformed, obviously, but similar dynamics in the culture and in the country. The problem, I think there's two ways I would very much engage your thesis. Your thesis is that the church my grandparents grew up in. So my grandparents grew up at the beginning of the 20th century at Hall in Kalamazoo. My grandmother worked in a farm on Lafayette, which, if you know where Madison Square is, Lafayette is just a few streets behind.
Mhm.
She was working in celery fields, and she'd tell me how they would have planks so that the celery wouldn't get green because nobody wanted to eat green celery. And she told me about a story where she, as a young girl, went to church, and there was the technology to have stockings that could be sort of colored similar to flesh. And so she comes to church one Sunday morning to Oakdale Park, and she's wearing flesh-colored stockings, and an elder in the church looks at her, probably in Dutch at this point, because this is before the First World War, and says, "Young lady, it is a terrible thing for you to come to church without stockings." And my grandmother, who was very deeply conservative woman, very much against women in office, my grandmother piped up to him and said, "These are flesh-colored stockings." I mean, she remembered that to, she remembered that and told me that story.
Yeah.
Now, the Calvin circulatory system, the feeder system, what I had noticed in the last 10, 15 years here is not that Calvin grads no longer move to Sacramento. They do.
But they don't look up Christian Reformed churches.
They don't go to any church.
So that could be too. Yeah.
No, that not that could be.
That is okay.
That is.
All right. All right. Sure.
And so you can tell the story in terms of the rise of evangelicalism, but my real beef with this book isn't that white evangelicals have issues in terms of how they get their religion and their politics mixed up. That's to me, that's a very uninteresting thesis. I think the bigger thesis is that what happened to the main line in American history, because the natural process for the Christian Reformed Church, very much in keeping with the Scandinavians, the Scandinavian evangelicals, the Lutherans. I mean, when the Christian Reformed Church 10, 15 years ago wanted to map out their big plan, they looked at the Covenant Church that had been successful in planting megachurches here in Sacramento. This is an area in which the Covenant Church has been enormously successful. Multiple megachurches in the distant suburb of wealthy whites, megachurch in my area, Bayside of South Sacramento, African-American leadership. I mean, they managed to do what home missions really wanted to do in the 80s and 90s. The Covenant Church managed to do it. Okay. And they managed to do it by basically taking the big box, non-denominational evangelical church and applying it in a way that most Christian Reformed pastors, by virtue of our formation, we just really couldn't do it. We couldn't sort of go full whole hog in that way, because the Christian Reformed Church has been in a process of assimilation. And the two dominant groups, all the way back to the modernist fundamentalist days, have been the mainline and the fundamentalists. And the fundamentalists sort of morph into the evangelicals, at least part of them. And the mainline, which had been in many ways the state church of the United States. You see that reflected in FDR. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt was this towering figure, especially, you know, in the formation of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And while on one hand, you can see the assimilation of Christian Reformed people into the evangelical world, you will spot the Left Behind series popping up in places like, I think my mother deep sixed it out of the library at Pleasant Street Christian Reformed Church in Whitensville, Massachusetts. I think she saw it there and it conveniently got checked out and never returned. But my mother, of course, born and bred in Whitensville, you know, nobody's gonna come after my mother because she's Henry Osterman's daughter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the real question here is, in many ways, there were two tracks in the Christian Reformed Church, the main line and the evangelical, and that assimilation process has continued. The prophilicity, I'm gonna share my screen. Well, let's see. Here, I'm gonna share this screen. Do you want to see prophilicity? Here's prophilicity. This is prophilicity of activism. And we've seen, you know, we saw in George Floyd during the pandemic, we saw George Floyd, people on their knees, people praying, people repenting. People were looking at and saying, wow, looks like another great awakening. I mean, outside of synod, these are, let's take from another rather high profile Calvin Seminary professor, James K.A. Smith. These are the liturgies of the civil rights movement adopted by all of the other liberationist movements hence. And these are within the Christian Reformed Church too. So on one hand, I will agree with you that these liturgies have been taken up by now the new conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church, but they are equally taken up by the other side in the Christian Reformed Church. I don't see a story in which the Christian Reformed Church establishment, rather moderate liberal establishment, sort of looking to the main line as this is the template that we want to follow. I don't see them being any less in terms of profiles as the other. The difference is that the move towards Americanization, the desire of River Terrace, the desire of home missions in the 80s, 90s, planting Granite Springs in Sacramento, the desire of, you know, sending a bunch of us to Willow Creek, but generation before sending my father to visit Robert Schuller in Southern California. I'm not going to disagree with the Americanization thesis, but you have to apply that across the board. And the key difference is the failure and collapse of the main line. And I would say the main line has sort of been completely subsumed in the bigger issues. But so when alternate paths to ministry is opened up, almost every change in sort of the old school sincerity program that has been put into place that has led to sort of the rapid rise of the young, restless, and reformed presence in the Christian Reformed Church. Almost all of those doors were opened by fundamentally mainline postured programs. We need alternate paths to ministry so people can go to Fuller and Princeton. Oh, but you know where else they're going to go? A lot of other places. We need ethnic diversity. Right now, let's say the left in the Christian, I don't like using these terms, but let's say the affirming wing of the Christian Reformed Church is the oldest, whitest, boomerist area of the church. And when I talk to African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, including Koreans, they are all deeply conservative. And this was exactly what split up the RCA. So when we had the Kingdom Enterprise Zone project, I got to know quite well RCA ministers here on the West Coast. Many of the RCA churches on the West Coast were young, restless, and reformed. Many of those church plants were complementarian when they were being planted. And I remember just before sort of the breakup of the RCA, which, by the way, Dan Ackerman, classmate of mine, former staffer at Home Missions, Tim Vink, very much a dunamis, reformed, pastored the Tulare Community Church further south in the valley here, very much a Signs and Wonders church. These two led the Alliance of Reformed Churches out of the RCA. And the big showdown in the RCA happened because the RCA church closest to me, a Chinese congregation, the pastor there told me the Asian, the Hispanic, and the African American leadership in the RCA, because the RCA had been trying to survive by church planting all over America, and the RCA had always been much more open to using these off-the-shelf methods from both groups. They basically came to the RCA leadership with an ultimatum and said, unless and until you do something about these liberal East Coast classes and churches, we're out of here. Eddie Aliman, who I knew because he was in Central California, trained by Neil Hageman, who was the most conservative missionary in the Dominican Republic when I went there, started mints in Southern Florida to train often Hispanic leadership. He becomes the general secretary of the RCA. I mean, what's amazing in this story is that if you don't look at the main line and you don't realize that almost all of the pathways by which the groups that are now in ascendance in the Christian Reformed Church, those doors were opened by the Christian Reformed establishment in pursuit of the post-war baby boomer liberationist authenticity culture. And so the dramatic aspect of this story is that in some ways, it was the CRC establishment that set the table with the knives that are now being pointed at them. And even over the last few years, what has amazed me has been how blind so many in the Christian Reformed Church who have had power for 30 years are to what they're doing. When they set the code of conduct, and again, it tended to be the establishment CRC that really wanted this code of conduct. And all of this was part of the culture of safetyism. They have built the guillotine that so many of them, their heads will roll from. Because And don't think that the conservatives haven't seen that on the Hesed Project website. They called out Jeff Wyma and dangled the code of conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you know how much tinkering a synod would need to do to that code of conduct to make it the absolute perfect purge tool to purify the denomination? I mean, I've been watching this happen. And, to me, and then Ken, he's put the numbers there. I mean, what I've seen, this has been happening to anybody who's watched closely in the church. You could see it I remember I was at Synod when, there were all of these complaints about the Office of Social Justice. The advisory committee comes back to the main floor with a recommendation of no substantive change, but basically we're going to slap the hands of OSJ, say more about abortion, less about some of these other issues, and basically nothing will happen. The advisory committee fails. And when I saw that at Synod, it might have been 2008. I thought things have changed from 1998. And then I'm at another Synod with a very tearful Bob DeMoore, mea culpa, apologizing to the denomination for what he put in the banner.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2016, and I thought the Christian Reformed establishment that has been primarily with this one track going on, this is when again, the advisory committee comes back and says, we're going to establish an HSR committee, and we are going to make sure that, because we're so dissatisfied with the 2016 report on pastoral care to homosexuals, we're going to make sure that everybody on this committee is within this framework. I thought, if you folks aren't paying attention, and then you go to 2018 and the all one body meeting in Grand Rapids, which Dan Winowski, a conservative, goes to, a conservative not with a Christian Reformed last name, with a Polish last name, goes to this meeting, and all one body basically publicly says what everybody knew, we're never going to get this through Synod. So what we're going to do is there's going to be a test case at some point. And yes, there will be. There's going to be a test case at some point, and basically the Christian Reformed Church won't have the guts to discipline. And I thought,
things have changed.
Big change. And then 2022
Not the
comes
same
around,
world.
and I knew the HSR would pass. I was less certain about the question of confessionality using that machinery. And then, of course, when the votes came in, it was, wow. And then I thought, okay, we know how Synod is structured. And from watching what I've watched in the denomination for the last 30 years, this was not surprising to me. And I'd been telling people, this is coming. We want to, 2012, we want to start talking about confessions and what they mean. And we want to start asking far deeper questions about how we read scripture. Are we all still on the same page? And so then 2022 comes, and then I'm talking to people that have been in my tribe, because I come from the racial reconciliation tribe. I'm talking to people in my tribe, and I'm saying, the house is on fire, people. Your, heads are going to roll. And I hear back, no, these are activists, and they just managed to get enough people going to Synod. And so for Synod 2023, we're going to have a big push to get the right people to Synod. And I'm thinking, y'all are fooling yourselves. And so Synod 2023 comes, and same story. And I'm still waiting for this group of people to wake up. And then in Synod 2022, they really push hard the code of conduct. They don't get it. They get it in Synod 2023 against a lot of conservative opposition. But the moderates, that seemed reasonable. We want to keep kids safe. Bad actors arise. You need the tools to deal with them. And I'm thinking, this group of people that have been in power in the denomination for a long time, and for the most part have had most of their agenda go through. They have set the table with the knives that are going to be used against them, and they still don't know it.
There's a counterfactual history, which I've written a little bit about, where, around 2007, 2008, 2009, when there were conversations about the form of subscription and women delegates and the Bellhart, all those things kind of happening in that window. In a previous era, again, before the internet, in a previous era, you could have predicted some sort of institutional right-wing split. Maybe not big, but enough to kind of put the brakes on it a little bit. That would have removed, it's hard to talk in these crude terms, but that would have removed a few of the extreme right voices on the 5% of the right of the denomination. And fast forward again to 2016 and 2021 and 2022 with the HSR, that really would have potentially happened again, right? Where there's this big issue, the establishment is strong, the right can't organize effectively enough to change the conversation within the denomination, but they can organize, effectively enough to remove themselves from the denomination. So there's all these periods, I feel like once a decade since World War II, where a thing happens and the 5% on the right, on the far right, leave, and the denomination keeps kind of this establishment-driven, moderate to left drift a little bit. I've argued that somewhere around 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, that the ability of the right to organize stopped that. And that's what, to me, is really undermined kind of the default institutional trajectory. And it's that fact that the establishment hasn't caught on to still yet in 2024.
And all you're saying, Kent, is exactly what I just said earlier, which is that it was about that point where you suddenly you weren't talking about authenticity culture anymore. You were talking about prolificity, and the right grabbed it much more firmly. You can show me the picture of the protest outside the Fine Arts Building when the HSR was being, but there were not a lot of people. They were all old. It was a I don't know what the CRC establishment is anymore. I don't know. We've been talking about establishment people but I don't know that we actually have a CRC establishment anymore. Who are they? Who are we talking about? Calvin professors? Calvin seminary professors? Yeah, there they are.
Do you know who the big guy is with the sleeveless top and the gray hair leading the charge? You know his name?
No, I absolutely don't.
I do. I know his name. He was a year ahead of me at Calvin. Very much big man on campus. He went to seminary with me. His name is Keith Manis.
Oh,
do a little Googling with Keith Manis.
I know Keith.
Yeah.
But I couldn't see from there. But anyway, yeah. But who are but Keith Manis is not even in the denomination anymore, right?
No, he isn't.
Yeah. So
which is key. This is, it's these things that tell. Keep going, Clay. I'm sorry. I should have interrupted.
So what establishment in the seminary professors? Calvin Seminary hasn't exercised theological leadership for years, except now a little bit with somebody like Jeff Wyma, leading it right. Okay. But you don't, that kind of gentle leftist leaning people, who are they? And the Calvin philosophy department no longer has that. You raise Christian
James K. Smith.
James K. Smith, but
we're beyond the days of Mao and Plantinga and Walter Storff and
or take the denominational office. Zach King is now the head guy, but that thing went through a whole lot of changes and shifts, and there's very little power out of the central apparatus they don't have the money anymore, for one thing. The money is they changed the money system with predictable results, and so what's happened is that denomination is going differently. It's going differently in a profound way. And maybe that moment in 2016 when, or even earlier in, what'd you say, 2008, Paul, when suddenly you started to have this kind of little bit more organized thing. Maybe that's when it shifted. I don't know. But we're not in the same denomination anymore.
Well, and I think organized is one issue, but demographics is the other. And again, part of what I hear from groups that are sort of, Hesed, Reformed Journal, I mean, is still around, obviously in a much different phase. It is not what it was, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But again, I hear people dismissing, oh, this is a factor of organization. No, it is a factor of organization, but you don't get swings in the votes like this without the reflecting of the demographic. I also just recently had a video pointed out, or I made a video pointing out that if you go back over agendas for synod and you look at roles of people going to church, for the vast majority, you never had empty slots in classical delegations. And this is for 2-week synods where people had to travel. I mean, it's interesting. I've been going through Acts of Synod, and all synods have this little note about basically, if you're going to drive, make sure you carpool, and please fly. I mean, this is all stuff that, Clay, you will very much remember.
Oh yeah, of course.
And but you never, I mean, to be able to go to synod was a high point. I don't know if my mother's father, Henry Osterman, I don't know if he ever went to synod as a delegate. He had been an elder in the church, but to actually, to get to be an elder of the church, now you've got status. And then to go to classis, now you've got even more status. And then to be able to be allowed to go to synod, I mean, for someone of my grandparents' generation, that really meant something. You were a person of status and consequence in your community. We've got 1 week, we've got free airfare, and you can't, Classis Hudson is sending 2 delegates to synod this year. Classis Hudson, when I was growing up, so one of the things in the 90s, I came back to New Jersey when I was doing my field work as a missionary in the Dominican Republic. And I looked around and thought, this Christian reformdom in northern New Jersey is a shriveling old person compared to what it was when I was growing up. And this gets back to, because Clay, you're right, you're sitting in Walnut Creek. There's no better example than Walnut Creek of this entire story. And so on one hand, it's easy to sort of say, it's a failure of your leadership, obviously, but you can't ignore, and I know, Clay, you tend to be prone to talk theologically. The theology of the left has simply not borne fruit in institutional Christianity. It's and culturally, that's
now, Paul. You're absolutely right. If you're going to tell the story, you have to do the de-churching of America story.
Yes,
as the framework over the whole thing. So in part, what happened in CRC churches is that the whole mission board wanted to expand, 400,000 by the year 2000, right? I mean, what's happened to that? So the whole mission board, for all the time, they kept grabbing whatever was the latest and greatest. So you mentioned Bob Schuller. They're sending people to Bob Schuller. Before that, it was James Kennedy. James Kennedy, Coral Ridge Presbyterian, evangelism explosion. And this is where, again, it fits into that, where you move from the sincerity culture into the authenticity culture. I remember people that I very much loved and respected talking to me about how, you got to ask those 2 questions, one of which is, if you went to heaven today,
if you were to die tonight, what would you say to Jesus to let you into his heaven?
That's right. That's right. Well, man, that is so
There's a frame around that.
right. So part of the frame around this is the fact that CRC churches weren't doing all that well. And so how do we build the denomination back up numerically? I mean, you can look at it in business terms. It was pretty cynical, but nobody meant it in cynical ways. They were all convinced of this. It was not. There were no bad actors in all this. It's just that what happens in CRCs. Let me just do a little aside here. What happens in CRCs is that people like Walnut Creek, for example, is that people who are so the CRC styles evangelical, and that really got reinforced when evangelical churches moved into Pentecostal worship, of which Kent was. There's a part of Kent's story that we have not talked about, which is Kent as the worship leader. And Kent being there at
well, he does go to Madison Square.
At the
that
Calvin,
says something.
Well, and Kent is a pianist. He is he's a primo worship pianist.
Wish he moved to Sacramento.
Right. Well, I mean, I employed him for a while.
That's right, at River Terrace for a little bit.
Yeah. But so CRC styles evangelical. You go to synods, and there's a beautiful big organ up in front in the Fine Arts Building, and it rarely gets played at a synods. Maybe once or twice during the synod they bring out somebody to play the organ. What you have is a band, right? So it does worship the way evangelical churches do worship. It doesn't do it the way mainline churches do worship. It does it with a band and with whatever's on the latest, whatever the Christian radio station is in the area. They sing those songs, and that's. But when people get there for a while, evangelicals come. They get there for a while. They start to notice that there's something a little off about the way CRCs do church. They're not really evangelical. And so at that point, they often just walk back out the door because they say, this church is not what it says, what it advertises. That I see as a total failure of leadership on the part of the denomination, that the denomination kept putting people into, okay, this church is doing well, Willow Creek's doing well, let's go there. Saddleback's doing well, let's go there. And none of that was actually CRC in any real sense. Maybe the covenant people figured out how to do that in a way that they could retain covenantalism or whatever. And
they're big box evangelicals.
Yeah, they're big box, right. So then let's go back to that thing about the mainline churches. What's happened to mainline churches?
One question, and maybe you can come back to this. I don't know if this is the right time to ask it, but to me, though, there is a sense of resurgence in returning to kind of those original, those ways of worship and being church that were characteristic of what, say, Third CRC was in the 70s and 80s. I'm thinking specifically, I listened to the podcast, The Messy Reformation. I don't know if the two of you have listened to that, but, Jason, I think his last name is Rice. I don't know how to pronounce it, but, he's interviewing pastors all over the Midwest. And it's such an important glimpse into the transformation that's going on in these churches. And it is a transformation, and he's interviewing pastors who are smoking meat all day Saturday, sitting on the patio, reading Bavinck, and the organ is played Sunday morning. And I do think there is a subset of churches that not only didn't go that direction, but is actively going the opposite direction now. And it's being led by guys in their 30s who are, reading Piper and reading Bavinck and reading Kuyper.
Yep.
Anyway, I didn't want to stop and bypass that, but continue.
No, Kent, that is absolutely perfect. That's exactly where I was going. So the fact is that mainline churches have gone down, right? I mean, they've lost, and they're continuing, I think, still.
Yeah, they're in a free fall.
I don't know that they're in a free fall, though. That's what I think. So I go to Episcopal churches a lot when I'm not preaching, and I go to Episcopal churches that look to me like they're growing, and that there is a kind of enthusiasm there, a sense of identity in those churches. And overall, maybe the Episcopal Church is still going down. But I don't think it's a free fall. I think that there's been a kind of settling over the last while of churches and people trying to figure out, okay, now, how do we do church in a post-evangelical time? And in some ways, the evangelicals have helped out because they've gone whole into right-wing politics, and there are a lot of people that just can't abide the church going wholesale into. I mean, maybe this is a mistake that the left made in the previous generation. They kind of went whole hog into a certain kind of liberal politics, and that turned people off, and they walked. They said, no, church should be about other things than that. And now I think maybe some of that's happening in the other direction. But what the CRC has failed to do is to articulate a reason for anybody to be CRC that is intrinsic to the actual tradition of which we're a part, and taking into that tradition Bavinck and Berkhoff and Kuyper and Calvin and so forth, but being able to, and the confessions, and be able to understand those confessions in terms of a historical flow, rather than weaponizing them to go after Christian Dumais or something.
Well, I think I agree with Ken in terms of, I look at these, how can I say this? There have always been sort of two Kuypers. Let's use Kuyper. If you've got one group that, when I went to Calvin, to be Kuyperian meant to be a transformationalist. And implicit in that transformationalism was a liberationism. And so that was the Kuyper that I heard, we want to be Kuyperian, we're going to go to movies, we're going to transform culture, we're going to turn our back on the pre-Second World War Christian Reformed Church. Now, I think, and then there's the other Kuyper, let's say the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, that looks at Kuyper and says, no, it was, okay, Chuck Colson. Let's get into it, the Chuck Colson chair at Calvin Seminary. So then there's the conservative Kuyper. And so in this way, people are looking at two different Kuypers. And what was remarkable is what's been visible in the last two synods. And what I think, again, many in the Reformed Journal camp, the 12, again, Pro-Felicity is not just Herb wearing overalls. Pro-Felicity is the, continuing sort of, the continuing sort of diminishment of the banner. It's been sort of what's happened to the Reformed Journal crew in terms of the denomination, and the fact that Calvin finally has a professor that wrote a book on the New York Times bestsellers list. And what is happening here is that the people coming into the denomination are, again, they're reading Piper. They went to his conferences. They are actually reading Bavinck, or they're reading Piper. They're actually reading Kuyper and Bavinck in their own way as reactions to modernism. So again, this modernist fundamentalist thing continues to work through the system. They are looking to have a confessionally reformed experience. Now, for many of these young pastors, and I'm going to name my friend Tim Blackman. What was so amazing to me with Tim Blackman in our denomination, he was again and again sort of platformed by the denomination because, well, he's he's not. Is Tim Blackman Dutch? He's far Dutcher than I ever will be because he's from the Netherlands. He's extremely articulate, very smart, extremely well read. And what was so amazing, when people would keep platforming Tim, I would keep thinking, I really don't know how conservative he is. But there's a conservatism that Tim has, which is tremendously Dutch, because he is Dutch. He grew up in the Netherlands. His father left the United States, escaping Jim Crow. So there's a narrative that the racial reconciliation tribe can get behind. He married a Dutch woman, so there's interracial marriage. He then becomes a Christian, and he becomes a young, restless, and reformed Christian in many ways, but extraordinarily well read. And some might say, well, why isn't he in the PCA? And that's probably a pretty good question. And someone might look at a bunch of other people who have fairly high profiles on the CRC right, and they might say, why aren't they in the PCA? And I think many of them that would say, well, the PCA might have been a viable option, but someone might have said about Tim Keller, why wasn't he in the CRC? Because Keller, if you'd look at Keller, he would often read Plantinga and Waltersdorf and cite Bavinck and Kuyper. And this is the crew that's there. And so again, what I see this as is when, let's say that the old Princeton broke up and Westminster, Philadelphia was established, where was the majority of the CRC? Who were they aligned with primarily? They were aligned with Westminster East, but they didn't quite fit OPC. That was a little too narrow, a little too restrictive. And they tended to lean a little bit more, again, this Dutch open. And what I see happening is that the Christian Reformed Church has actually managed to attract people not from our colonies who temperamentally, in some ways, approximate that kind of conservative, self-consciously confessional, and that's exactly what they're looking for.
So Paul, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm not a conservative in that sense, but I am looking for that kind of quality of discussion, of theological discussion. What I don't do. You and Kent do the sociological stuff, the kind of history of the church, that sort of thing. I mean, I dabble in that, but that's not what I do. What I do is theology and scripture, and that's what and I think there's a huge area that we could have a discussion. But if the church splits, as it looks like it will, or if maybe it won't split, maybe they'll just sort of carve off Grand Rapids East or whatever. If that happens, that quality of conversation, what was the term you used? It was the kind of temperamental setting of the CRC will be lost. And to some extent, it is a temperament more than anything else. I remember going to attending on behalf of the CRC, I think, an evangelical Presbyterian synod, and when they did things, they had it whereas this, it looked like legal documents. CRC would never do that. CRC was never legalistic in that sense.
It was familial.
It was familial. That's what I want us to just stop for a moment and say, for Synod 2024, just stop for a minute and say, what are we losing here? And what we're going to be losing is exactly that, so that maybe Tim Blackman and I could have a conversation about theology, and do that, over and then maybe disagree profoundly, and walk away and still say we belong to the same denomination.
And that's that's the kind of temperament, that's the kind of denomination that's going to continue to produce people like Nicholas Walterstorff and Alvin Plantinga and Kristen Dumais and all these people that, can do their best work within this kind of framework. And they couldn't do that kind of work in if we split in that other framework. The boundaries are too hard. They're not porous enough to kind of let in things from the outside in the best way. That's what I fear.
And Nick and Al Plantinga, Nick Walterstorff and Al Plantinga needed, in some sense, Calvin to be a place where they could develop their thought enough so that then when Nick went to Yale and Al went to Notre Dame, they could survive it. If they had just stayed at Yale and or gone to Notre Dame and Yale without that Calvin experience, they would not have had the grounding. We need that quality of conversation that we're losing.
Okay. And now I think you started off, Clay, talking about a failure of leadership. And I think right now in the left, we have a significant failure of leadership, because what do you do when you find yourself heading towards something you don't want? You're going to have to take a problem and figure out how to turn it into an opportunity. And I think it would have been better if we had done this a few years ago, but I think there are still ways to turn this into an opportunity, because the groups of churches that are probably going to start being put out, these groups of churches need to get ahead of being put out and start to figure out, okay, how can we develop structures now? And these are structure people. These are people that have been working on structures and thinking theologically and doing all this for a very long time and being willing to play with structures. You look at Church of the Servant. That's a church that's sort of at the epicenter grew out of that moment at Calvin with Nick Walterstorff. And, these people know how to do structure. They know how to do institution. They know how to think theologically. What they need to do is to begin to think, okay, I agree with everything both of you just said now in terms of what we need to do. And this is why I've been asking for a confessional conversations. It's a difficult thing to pull off. We're actually beginning to have one now. What we need to do is begin to have the kinds of structures that permit the kinds of conversations we need to have. And in many ways, we have not, for example, so the church by narrow margins approved women in office. That was in many ways the death of the conversation around women in office, because people didn't dare talk about it because they had something to lose politically. And so what you want is a structure that's going to be able to take the political off the table and say, beneath the women in church office question and beneath the human sexuality question are deep theological issues that we have to engage. But we're going to have a structure by which we can actually have these conversations without holding guns to each other's livelihoods.
And Paul, that is actually happening in many local congregations. I've been in Walnut Creek for a year. I was in Beaverton, Oregon for 6 months. And there are conversations happening there about theology, which and people are very much disagreed about the big issues. Maybe not so much about women anymore, but they are disagreed about same-sex marriage and so forth. And they're not willing to blow up those congregations to engage those issues sort of directly. That they don't want to have a fight about that, because they want the quality of conversation and worship and other things that are happening that keep them together. And I can give you, I've been here for a year, and I can tell you that in this congregation, there are people all over the map about the issues that are exercising the CRC. But at the same time, every Sunday morning we get together, and when we get together, we we look at scripture, and then actually we have a class afterwards called Talk Back, and we sit in this room, and it's not a very big group, but we sit in this room and we talk about our experience of being Christian in the Bay Area, and that's rich and deep. And I've had that, I preach in Linden. I haven't in a while because I haven't been there, but I preach in Langley, British Columbia. I preach in the Seattle area, Oregon, whatever. Cross Point Church in Chino, California, which is a very conservative church in many ways. And you know what? In every place, the quality of conversation is good, and there are a lot of great people.
But we haven't, I've got this estuary project going. What we haven't as a church done well is have a kind of conversation where that is in some ways open enough, but also not threatening. And
You're so
again,
right.
what's going to happen in Synod 2024, I think, is not hard to predict. We're probably going to have a tightening of the gravamen system.
Right.
There are going to be moves towards disciplining Grand Rapids East and or potentially other and local committees for other churches that have put talk about prophilicity. They're putting statements on their website. Yep. And in many ways, there's deep issues beneath this prophilicity question that are forced upon us because of technology, and we are relating in different ways because of technology. And we have to have those kinds of conversations too.
The challenge is that, I started writing the Substack a month ago, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from people on the right, very far right, people firmly in the middle, and people on the very far left. Almost none of the feedback I get from the middle and the left is public. It's always in the form of emails, lots of Facebook messages, things like that. Because those conversations, to your point about being threatening, can't be public if there's a continual tightening of the way things need to be, because that opens people up to potential problems after Synod 24, 25, 26, depending on how these conversations end up going. So, I know, Paul, you've talked a lot about confessional conversations, but it's hard to have conversations, period, right now, because the threat level is just too high.
They're coming for me.
I don't know how to solve that, but that is the reality, and that's a real breakdown. We mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I can't remember if it was me or you, Clay, but the ability to kind of fight within the family in a different era, and that can't happen right now because there's people at risk of losing ordination, and these are young people with families and churches, and what's going to happen. So those conversations can't be productive right now. And I don't know how to solve that.
Well, every Sunday morning at 9 a.m., you can come to Living Stones to an estuary meeting. Estuary is church adjacent. I have people who come, they have zero church background. Some of them are curious about church, but, and so all over, we're having people that are having productive conversations, and there are ways to do that. Now, we're as a denomination, I wish we were having these conversations a decade ago. I really do. But it was interesting when I first started talking about confessional conversations, it tended to be the CRC left that really didn't want it. And I think I got a lot of interest from the right, but not a lot from the left. And because, again, for the left, I had the sense that people thought, I have a lot to lose, and I like the status quo because we think we're still pretty much in charge of the future. And I was telling him, I don't think you're in charge the way you think you are, because demographics are changing. And so I think at this moment now, where, again, there is going to be a tightening, there is going to be churches put out, or at least the process of being put out, and we're going to see the Christian Reformed Church in some ways be similar to the church in the 1920s and 30s. And if you go back and read that history, I think you can see a fair amount of resonance. than let's say the church, churches since the Second World War. So there'd be sort of a reverting back to an older form of the Christian Reformed Church in some ways. But I mean, I see so much. I see so much brain power. I see so much capacity. When I in Little Sacramento look at Grand Rapids, because of the circulatory system, which is sort of, is sort of bogged down. And so you have a whole wealth of retirees in West Michigan with theological education, confessional knowledge, institutional ability, financial resources. I mean, Better Together went out and got a $1 million plus grant from Lilly. Abide has been doing things, on a shoestring, and
No budget.
Abide's still kicking their butts.
Yep.
So, I look at this and I look at the groups that are now have the guns being pointed at them. And I'm like, is this tribe gonna get a clue and be able to look at this now and say, okay, let's stop fighting the fight we've been trying to fight for the last 10 years and try and turn this disaster into an opportunity. How can we do that? Because the time is almost done. And they, I don't know how many Synod votes they want to lose until they think, what do we need to do? And I think there are some really interesting opportunities. I would like to see, and not a sort of a rush to the RCA, because then you're just going to get lost in that whole mess. That's been a long-standing fight. I would rather see churches try to become, let's say, an affirming CRC. Maybe you'll have 20, 30 churches together who will sort of they'll be in exile. But if they say, we've got a lot of institutional commonalities, can we broker deals across this divide to figure out, in this divorce, what happens to Calvin in this divorce? What happens to the pension in this divorce? What happens to all of these things in divorce? And the thing is, CRC moderates that I think are the ones who actually hold the keys here. CRC moderates, in many ways, we saw that last synod, want to keep the family together, but they are not trusting of what they've seen come down the pipe culturally. And I think that's part of the reason their votes have swung the other way. And so I think, these people have all sorts of smarts and brains, and they should, if anyone in the denomination can figure this out, they should be the people. And I'm just still waiting for them to say, okay, let's make some lemonade here. And I think that could be a really amazing thing. But I haven't seen anybody really take up the challenge.
Yeah, maybe that's the case. But so there are some very large institutional pieces of the CRC that are going to be challenged if the CRC begins to split. And one of them is Calvin, obviously. And Calvin is already challenged by that. I mean, a fairly small percentage of its budget comes from the CRC, but there's a long institutional connection. It's owned by the CRC, lock, stock, and barrel, and so forth. And the other one is World Renew, which has leveraged contributions into an enormous budget for development work in the world. And those two pieces, I don't know what happens to those exactly. I just contributed what for me was a pretty substantial contribution to Calvin, and that was just before the president got fired, and I'm hoping that place survives because my experience at Calvin was very much like Kent's. We came from a small town that was pretty insular. And you come to a place like Calvin, and all of a sudden you have people reading interesting things, thinking interesting thoughts, having discussions, and it was enormously powerful experience. Will that survive? I don't know. I'm not sure who takes this up. You know, Paul, you're challenging, but it's not like there is a kind of establishment anymore. I mean, there's a few people that are retired, but you know, who's going to do this? Calvin Seminary?
I think part of how leadership has migrated is we have to think more in terms of bodies and spirits than, I mean, yeah, back in the day, you would look to, you could look to some of the, I mean, it's amazing when you go through reams of synods, how many last names. I mean, Scott Greenway's grandfather, Leonard, being president of synod. And so, yeah, this familial network is not what it used to be. But I think, I don't think the challenge, I think the challenge is that of vision. And I,
Agree.
and I've wanted to try to, I mean, I don't find myself, I mean, I'm in Sacramento. I'm not in a place to lead a charge in Grand Rapids, but maybe that's pro-felicity, because what I see is a continual appetite to keep fighting this battle from the left. And I just want to say, you've lost. And when you lose, you need to adopt a new strategy to figure out, okay, what happens after the loss, and to get on that page. And again, I don't think it's crazy, given all of the familial connections, all of the relational networks that are thick in a place like Grand Rapids, to say, or Western Michigan, to say, okay, so maybe we can't share a synod. Okay, let's figure out what we can and can't share, because both sides sort of like World Renew. Calvin, well, it's hard to figure out things. Okay, what is Calvin now? Calvin is not what it was in my grandfather's day, and it's not what it was in my father's day, in terms of how it functions in the denomination. And it isn't even part of the circulatory system anymore. I mean, it's ironic that you had a hand and a heart that used to be the dominant symbol. It was the heart. It kept, pumping people around. Okay, so now we're going to have to recognize we're living in a different time, and what kinds of institutions in this age of pro-felicity do we need? Part of what made the heyday of the philosophy department at Calvin what it was is it sought to bless the world with something, and it did. And I think, despite the fact that, okay, maybe what are the vehicles, what are the institutions through which we can bless the world? And I continue to think that in terms of the Christian Reformed Church, maybe it'll be divided into two. We still have a lot to bless the world with. And we haven't sort of fallen off the cliff with the United Methodists, let's say. Okay, so now we're going to have some kind of split going on here. But I think probably better than a lot of people, we have tools to have a confessional conversation. So even if there is a split, let's figure out how to keep talking after the divorce, because actually both sides need it.
Paul, I think that's what's not going to happen. So what's going to happen? I mean, if I were just sort of predicting this, and I'm on the West Coast out here too, so I've no position to do this, but I would say that Synod 2024 or 25 or whatever is going to push hard enough to kind of push most of Grand Rapids East out. And along with Grand Rapids East, there'll be a number of other churches that will in some way join up with it. So we will have the Church of Grand Rapids East kind of thing. And Calvin will have to make a choice about where it goes here. And I don't know exactly where that's going to go. I have no idea about that. If Calvin, in fact, decides to stay with what's left of the CRC, I mean, stay with the CRC, what's now the dominant CRC, as you pointed out, they will become a very different kind of school, because they will have professors there like, oh, well, I can tell you that I think Kristen Dumais, is on thin ice.
There's an overture from Minn Kota about not this exact thing, but kind of tightening things around the faculty covenant, I believe, which I can't remember the substance of that,
Oh, yeah,
but it's
no, there's
getting
all
at
kinds of
exactly what
stuff.
you're talking about.
There's all kinds of stuff about, there's this kind of gravamen light that Calvin's Board of Trustees has in place. That's being attacked at 2024. So, I don't know how that's going to go, because that's a whole institutional question and has a lot of legal aspects and so forth. World Renew, I think, could just step away without any problem at all, because their funding doesn't come from any kind of ministry shares. They are probably owned by the CRC in some kind of technical way, but they function pretty much as a independent agency, have for a long time. So then what will happen is that those two groups will not talk to each other at all. It will be exactly like what happened with the CRC and the RCA back in 1857. In 1857, a group of churches, a few churches, decided they were going to form the CRC because those churches in the East were all too liberal. And they formed the CRC, and then for years, they lived side by side. In Linden, Washington, there was eventually 2 RCA churches and 4 CRC churches, and they didn't talk to each other.
Within 3 blocks of each other.
Yeah, right. From Third Linden, which is Third Linden CRC, which both Kent and I grew up in, you could see 2 other churches, that RCA churches, right? And then maybe in 100 years, they'll start to talk if they both survive. That's kind of what's going to go on here. And I don't think that the rump CRC is particularly stable either, because it's going to have to decide what its theology is, and its theology is Young, Luscious, and Reformed. It's going to be a lot more like the PCA than it is going to be like CRC, and so maybe that's kind of the direction that goes in. So, right now, denominationalism we could talk about that. Denominationalism, we probably should finish here, but denominationalism is itself in a lot of trouble, right?
Yep.
So there's a Presbyterian church, I have not actually gone there, but there's a very large Presbyterian church in Walnut Creek Presbyterian Church. It had a heyday in which it was a kind of mainline mega church. Then they had some pastoral issues and it went down. I mean, I know this because there's people here now that came from that church. And now it's an echo church, ECO.
Yep.
So it's left
Laura Smith's denomination.
Is that Laura Smith's? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but it's apparently on the rise again. I hear it's doing pretty well. So that's probably the future of CR. It'll also be Walnut Creek Reformed Church, or Walnut Creek Church. It's actually called Faith Christian Fellowship now. So be Faith Christian Fellowship, and in parentheses behind it, a Reformed congregation. And it will not have an affiliation with the CRC any longer, but it will be in one of those denomination-like kind of things,
Well, I agree with you that, the fact that the ARC, the Alliance of Reformed Churches, could begin with basically laptops and cell phones. And the denomination is selling its offices.
Right.
And I think you're exactly right. In one of my videos, I pointed to John Baer. He's an English, Bigo Orthodox scholar who, even the Orthodox are asking questions, what is the church beyond the local church? We are very much in that level, and a culture of prophylicity begs that question where, again, it's super interesting that churches that want to signal their affirming stance do so on a web page. It's easy to sort of dump and say, we're going to pit sincerity against authenticity, against prophylicity. There's a way you can do that to sort of compare and contrast, but in many ways, each level has a legitimacy of its own. And you sort of have to understand their role and how they function together.
And they coexist.
Yes, they do. In all of us.
In all of us, in every one of us. That's exactly right.
Yep.
And that's the so we need we will get new institutional ways of being denominational, or we won't be denominational, but we'll have new ways of associating individual congregations with each other. And this is the American story, just kind of writ small, I guess, in that eventually we're all headed towards congregationalism. I mean, that's kind of the American way, but we do it by, you know, grabbing onto people that are like us, and then we have this little group and this little group. But the old kind of European-based denominations, denominationalism was invented in America because you had these kind of European churches which had to figure out a way to be church in a multicultural situation. That's ending. It's that long history starts with the Dutch. The Dutch were the first denomination in New Jersey and New York. The Dutch Reformed Church, that's where it started, and it's going to be done. And we will be the Alliance of Reformed Churches, or the ECHO, or there's a couple of them now for the Methodists that are, so
Global Methodist movement and so on.
Yeah, there'll be, in the Episcopal Church, you got Anglicans now. God bless their heart. Who are, if you're an Anglican in the United States of America, that means that you're conservative on the issue of same-sex marriage. That's what it means. And you probably have a bishop who lives in Uganda. So you couldn't have done that a number of years ago.
Well, I want to give Kent the last word, because I feel bad because he's on here with two preachers, and so to get a word in edgewise is really hard. So Kent, you get the last word.
I don't even know. I don't know if I have a last word. I haven't thought through the future very much. I'll just say that. I think I'm more cynical than the two of you on the power of institutions. And when I look at what folks like Abide are doing, regardless of how you feel about them theologically or ideologically or politically or in some other way, how they're doing what they're doing, I think, is a template for whoever's going to win. I'm not saying Abide's going to take the form of a denomination. That certainly is not what's happening. But my take is that group wants to, I wrote somewhere when I overstated it and retracted it that they are anti-institutional. I don't think they're anti-institutional, but I do think that there's a sense where they're tired of funneling time, money, people, personnel somewhere and not reaping the benefits. So I think whatever form the future CRC takes, it's going to fix that. For better or for worse for everyone, I think that is what's going to happen. But again, I haven't thought a lot about the future. I really don't know what's going to happen.
Nor do we.
All right.
So
well, thank you, Clay. Thank you, Kent. And thanks, John Van Donk, for initiating this whole thing. Little Wiener didn't come on. But I love John, and he knows that. And then, of course, John has been my partner in the whole estuary project, which has been, facilitating. Most of our conversations aren't churchy necessarily, but certainly God and, church, those things are always sort of in the wings of it. But all right, I'm gonna end the recording. So thank you both.
Thank you.
thank you.